praise the Lord, and pass the ammunition. It's time for the GunGuyTV podcast.
Hi, this is Joel Persinger. I'm the Gun Guy. Thank you very much for all of your help and all of your support on GunGuyTV and for listening to this podcast. I'm very, very grateful that you do that. Now, you may hear a little bit of a difference in the podcast this time around because I'm a day late. Unfortunately, it's the 21st, and this is supposed to come out on the 20th. My wife and I's anniversary is in October, and so as a result, we took a few days to go on a little trip to get away for our anniversary, which we do every year. And as a result, you're hearing this a little differently because I'm actually using one of our headsets to do this rather than the studio. The headset gets rid of the echo in the hotel room and the background noise and that kind of stuff. So forgive me for the slightly different sound. Hopefully it'll be okay, and the podcast will still sound good for you. These headsets are actually new to us. We're going to be using them in SHOT Show to do some interviews there. I know Rick Travis from CRPA will be interviewing with us at SHOT Show, as will Sam Paredes from Gun Owners of California. I'm working with a gentleman named Jordan at Gun Owners of America in hopes that someone from them, that outfit, will come and interview with us at SHOT Show. And we also have some interviews set up with Nikon and CMMG and some other manufacturers. So hopefully we'll have some really good audio podcasts from SHOT Show this coming January. And in the meantime, it gives me an opportunity, since we're doing a little traveling, to try out this headset and see how well it works for you. All right, now today's podcast is again an hour long, the first half an hour of which is available on your favorite podcast player. And so if that's where you're listening, that's why you're listening to it, because it's available there. The second half an hour is available on Patreon only. So you have to be actually a Patreon patron and helping GunGuyTV on Patreon to get that second half. You'll find a link for that, in case you'd like to do that, in the description. Now, if for some reason you can't find that link, then you can just go to our website at GunGuy.tv or GunGuyTV.net or GunGuyTV.com. Any of those will get you there, and you can click on the link to Patreon there and join us on Patreon. Now, in this first part of the podcast, I thought we would talk about a touchy subject, if you don't mind touchy subjects. And this one kind of is one. It comes up a lot when I'm interviewing Rick Travis from the CRPA, because he brings it out a lot, and he'll call everybody out on it. It comes up occasionally with Sam Paredes as well, and others who fight on a daily basis for our Second Amendment rights, not just in the state of California, but throughout the United States, and particularly those who fight for those rights in very restrictive states like California. And that is the debate between whether you should move out and take your money and your guns with you and go to a gun-friendly place, or stick around and fight the battle. Now, I've chosen to stick around or fight the battle, but I'm not arguing from that point of view, or any point of view for that matter. I have my opinion, but what I would like to do is just lay out the arguments that I hear from both sides for you. We'll chat about that for just a few minutes here. In the second part of the podcast, I want to do something a little bit more fun and try to stay away from politics if I possibly can, and just talk about the types of shooting that I did as a kid, because I'm kind of curious what kind of shooting you did as a kid. Hopefully you learned to shoot as a child. Some of us do, and a lot of us don't anymore, because now the country has become more urban and less suburban. When I was a kid, I grew up in a suburban area, and I grew up around my dad and my grandfathers, and they were all hunters, and they were all people who loved to shoot. So I did a lot of shooting as a kid. So we'll talk about that kind of stuff and what my favorite kind of shooting is today and why I like it as opposed to other things. We'll talk a little bit about hunting and that kind of stuff, and that'll get us off of, I hope, the political agenda, at least for one podcast, and then we'll probably have to get back on it. That may not seem that interesting to you, and if not, I get it, but, at the same time, gosh darn it, sometimes it's good to just get away from the craziness and talk about more fun stuff, and so I'll talk about that, and how I, at this point, go out shooting with my kids and what we do that is kind of akin to what I did when I was a child, and how we keep shooting fun and shooting as part of our culture. I think that's the part that sometimes we're missing. Shooting is part of the American culture. It's not just something that a bunch of weirdos do. Okay, I might be a little weird, but that's got nothing to do with it. All right, but first subject matter is, gee, if I live in a restrictive state, should I stay and fight or should I go? Okay, well, YouTube being what it is, everybody has an opinion, and sometimes people will share those opinions very respectfully, and sometimes they will share them in ways that are, to put it mildly, insulting and demeaning and angry. I get it. There's a lot of frustration going on out there, and so people do get frustrated with this stuff. I know I certainly do. So if I voice an opinion about whether you should stay or go, or anybody on my show does, you can be assured that there will be a lot of opinions shared in the comment section. And as I said, some of those are going to be respectful, and some of them, quite frankly, get deleted because they involve a lot of curse words and insults and that kind of stuff. I wish we could actually carry on a discussion nowadays without treating each other that way, but it seems to have devolved into nothing more than a shouting match on a regular basis. It's unfortunate, if you ask me. I think it would be nice if people could actually talk, but they don't. Well, that's a whole subject for a different podcast, though, I think. So let me lay them out for you. Here's the argument on the side of fighting, staying where you are and fighting, and that's exactly what I'm doing. And once I lay out the argument, I'll also explain there's some other details associated with it. But the argument is that you have to fight the battle where it is. And if you don't fight it where it is, then it's going to follow you wherever you go. And so you may move away and go to a gun-friendly place, but that's only a temporary reprieve from the fight. That doesn't keep you from having to fight the battle at some point. At some point, where you live is likely to be as anti-gun as where you're leaving. Now, I think there is some validity to that. California certainly is an example of that. When I was growing up here, as I've said many times, I'm in my 60s, and when I was growing up here in California, it was a decidedly Republican state, and it was a decidedly conservative state. We have a lot of military bases here. It was a heavy military state, and we didn't have the kind of progressive, I guess you would call it, or socialist, anti-gun type mindset that we have now. Now, particularly in San Diego, where I live. San Diego, when I was growing up, had a very small town feel to it. It was not a city. It was a city, but it was a smaller city in California, and it felt like a small town. Everybody knew everybody. Not literally, but it sure felt that way. And actually, there was a lot of pride taken in being a San Diego native. There used to be bumper stickers people would put on their cars or bicycle or motorcycle or whatever that would say, San Diego native. And if you were a native of San Diego and you could actually do that, that was something. You were somebody. That was important. I remember when we used to have radio and television commercials and little ads in the paper that would thank people for coming and spending their tourist dollars here, but please don't move here. Go home. Thank you very much for your money. Now, go home. Well, those ads didn't work. By the way, I remember those ads in Oregon as well, and they didn't work there either. And so, San Diego is one of those places where the weather is beautiful, and the beach is nice, and there's lots of things to do here that I often forget because I live here. In fact, when my wife and I generally go on these kinds of little junkets like we are now, a lot of times, and including this year, we'll do what's called a staycation. And the reason why we do that is because since we live in San Diego County, we oftentimes forget that San Diego is a place that people travel from around the world to come and see because there's so much to do here. It's a tourist mecca, really, in a lot of areas, and we forget that. And then when we take some time to look around, we go, oh, wow, we've never been there. We've never been here. We've never been there. In fact, my wife discovered on this little trip that all the time we've lived in San Diego, I've been here since I was a child, and she's been here for probably 35 years or more. She had never been on Shelter Island. She had never been to Humphreys by the Bay. She had never been. There's a few places she'd never been. We live here. So we actually went to those places for this little anniversary getaway. And it was a lot of fun. We visited the Jennings House Cafe, and we went up and saw the Cabrillo Monument and that kind of stuff. But anyway, I'm digressing. I apologize. The argument then is that if you, as I said, if you stick around, you can fight the battle where you are, and if you leave, the battle will follow you. Well, as I said, there's some validity to that. When I was a kid in California, it was not illegal to have a gun in your car. It was legal to have a revolver or something in your glove box. They didn't have center consoles back then, but you could have it in your glove box, and it was legal to do that. It was not illegal to own any kind of firearm you wanted to buy. I remember as a child when my grandfather could go to the gun shop and buy a gun and leave with it. That was California. And again, the people who lived here wanted to keep it that way, but it didn't stay that way because folks came from other places where the weather was not so nice, where the scenery was not so nice, where there weren't as many really cool things to do, and they moved instead to San Diego. They wanted to get away from New York. No, I'm not picking on New Yorkers. I'm just pointing out this is a fact. I'm not making it up. People wanted to get away from cities like New York and cities like Chicago and so on. Not because they wanted to get away from the city so much as they wanted to get away from the weather. They wanted to get away from the winter time. They wanted to get away from look, I was in Connecticut for quite some time, and I can tell you Connecticut is beautiful, but they have 4 seasons: snow, mud, bugs, and road construction. Where you come out here, we have 1 season. It's called nice, beautiful, sunny most of the time. And so when you come out to visit here, it's really hard to go home knowing that you got to get back and using your snowblower and all that other stuff and trudge through the snow and deal with all the weather when you're trying to work for a living. So people moved out here for that reason, and that indeed was something that they did while at the same time bringing their politics with them and bringing their concerns for their way of living with them. They essentially took, in many ways, the political things they didn't like in these big cities and brought them with them to California and then began to change California into what they had left. Now, Californians, we resisted that mightily, but it didn't help us any. And all these decades later, California has become what all those folks left trying to escape. And now what are they doing? They're packing up, trying to escape what they've created and go to the next nice place. Well, we'll talk about some of those places in just a minute. Among the things you can do to help GunGuyTV stay alive is obviously join us on Patreon. So I wanted to let you know there's a few things on Patreon available to you there that you can't get listening to the podcast in its syndicated form. Obviously, the second half of the podcast is included on Patreon, where it's not included here. And then I also do a video podcast once a month. Actually, twice a month. What am I saying? I do a video podcast twice a month that's available only on Patreon. I just did one on why police officers tend to accidentally shoot civilians and what's going on with their training and what can be done with it. As a guy who's trained, police officers and security officers and whatever, and I own a company to do that, I can tell you I have a little bit of insight into their training, and I shared that on that video podcast. There's some other things on there, too. I do behind-the-scene posts so you can see what's coming up next for coming features on GunGuyTV. I do some behind-the-scenes stuff on what I happen to be working on at that particular moment or what part of the country I'm in, and I put up posts and pictures and use it in some way as a place for my Patreon patrons to enjoy some content they can't get anywhere else. Well, if you'd like to check that out, you can find the link in the description for this podcast. And if you can't find it there, just go to our website at GunGuy.tv or GunGuyTV.net or GunGuyTV.com. It'll all take you to the same place, and you can click on the Patreon banner. That will take you right to our Patreon page, and you can check out what's there. And if you'd like to, you can subscribe on Patreon.
The opinions expressed by the Gun Guy are always right, unless they're wrong.
Well, when we get back to the subject at hand, which is people moving around and changing things, I think it is arguably obvious that is happening to cities like Denver. Denver, Colorado, and Colorado in general did not always have the anti-gun and sort of progressive-leaning philosophy that it has now. I remember in Oregon, for example, in getting out of Colorado. In Oregon, when I was a boy, my dad was a sheriff's deputy up there in Columbia County. He lived in Clatskanie, Oregon, and he was a resident deputy up there. Well, during that time, you'd see people carrying guns all the time. Open carry, as it's quaintly called now, was a standard thing. People carried guns all over the place, and carrying a gun in a concealed fashion, as far as I know, was completely legal because just about everybody you run into was either carrying one openly or concealed. Hunting was not objectionable to people. Gun rights were considered to be obvious. I mean, isn't it obvious that you have the right to keep and bear arms, they would think, in Oregon? Washington was very much the same, and yet you see these Pacific states, California, Oregon, Washington, are all very left-leaning now, when, as a child, I can tell you for a fact they once were not. Well, where did that come from? Again, I remember visiting my dad in Oregon and hearing the ads on the radio that said, "Thank you very much for visiting Oregon. Now please go home." Gee, that sounded familiar to me. I lived in San Diego, and we had similar ads. Well, they didn't work any better in Oregon than they did in San Diego, and folks moved from other parts of the country that were higher taxes. They were punished with higher taxes there. They had less freedom there. They escaped those places to go to places like Oregon, to go to places like Washington, to go to places like San Diego, California, and other nice places of California. And when they did, they brought their philosophies with them, and they came and changed these states into what they had run away from. So when the argument comes out that says, hey, you know what, stay and fight the battle where it is, because if you run away, you can only run away for so long because it's going to catch up with you at some point, there is some actual validity to that argument. Now, we have to take into consideration, I think, the stage of life we're in and other things at the same time. But nevertheless, there is a lot of validity in that argument. I'll give you another one. You look at certain cities in Texas. You know, you would think that gun rights would be inviolate in Texas, that there's no way in the world you're going to change anything in Texas. Arizona's the same way. What are you going to change where gun rights are concerned in Arizona? Yet you look at Maricopa County in Arizona, and it's going decidedly liberal. It's moving that way pretty fast. That's where Phoenix is. That's where the big city is. You look in Texas, you're going to find that the big cities are becoming more and more anti-gun, more and more left-leaning, even in the great state of Texas, in the Lone Star State. Hard to believe, but it's happening. Why? Well, because what's happening now is people are leaving the high-tax states like California, where the cost of living is ridiculously high. The taxes are burdensome. The regulations are overbearing. And they've essentially, the states have become terribly overregulated, and folks don't want to put up with that, so they leave. And what they do is they take with them their California, now what they would now call their California mindset, which used to be their New York and New Jersey mindset or whatever. And then some of them come from New York and Jersey and these other places, and they move to Florida, which is now struggling in these areas as well in some cities, or they move to these other states, which have been very, very free. And what do you get? Well, you get this change in the law because they are bringing with them what they are so eager to run away from. That's why I'll get comments all the time. I mean, I get them a lot. I'll get comments quite frequently on the YouTube channel from people that'll say, stay in California. That place ought to be cut off from the United States. Hopefully it'll break off one day and sink into the ocean and take all those rat Californians with them. And whatever you do, if you move anywhere, don't bring your California mindset with you. You can't change us in Texas, or you can't change us in Colorado, or you can't change us in Utah, or you can't change us in pick a state. Doesn't matter. Well, the problem is, yes, they can, and yes, they do. They move from place to place, and everywhere they go, they ruin. And once they've ruined it, they can't figure out how that could possibly have happened to them, and they move to the next place and ruin that. You know, there was an old... when I became a Christian, now I'm not going to go all Christian on you here, but I do, because sometimes I do, and I get it. You know, I tell you, I'm a Christian. I'm a Bible reader, and I am a faithful Christian, so I talk about that a lot. But I'm not going to talk about that so much here. It's just to give you an instance. When I became a Christian, I had a gentleman who was helping me a lot. In fact, I had a few of them who were helping me a lot to change my life, to apply biblical teachings to my life. I'll never forget talking to one of them about some things that had happened in my life, and it seemed like every time I did this went wrong, and blah, 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 blah. And I would say, it never fails. I try this, and this goes wrong, and I do that, and that goes wrong, and blah, 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 blah. I went on in my long, whiny, complain lament. And he asked me a simple question. He said, well, let me ask you, how many years has that been happening? And I said, I don't know, it seems like all my life. He said, okay, well, who was there every time that went wrong? And I looked at him and I thought about that. And I said, well, nobody. He said, well, no, there was somebody there every time that went wrong. Who was there each and every time that went wrong? And I really had the noodle on it, and I couldn't think of a single person who was there every time that went wrong. Not one. I mean, I sprinkled up my forehead and I just thought about it because I thought, he's trying to make a point here. I don't want to seem stupid. But I cannot come up with a single person that was always there when this went wrong. What in the world is he referring to? He said, well, no, there really was. There was one guy who was there each and every time this went sideways for you. And suddenly the light bulb went off, and I realized the one person who was always there, the individual who was present every time, the one he was trying so hard to point out to me, was me. It was at that moment that I realized I was my own problem. It was at that moment that I realized it was me who was screwing it up. It was me who was messing it up. It was me who was causing these things to happen over and over and over again. It was my decision-making. It was my thought processes. It was my own pride, arrogance, and selfishness. It was, good grief, list the various different reasons why I was screwing up my life. It was me. Anti-gunners simply cannot and will not see that wherever they go, they screw it up, and then they run away to the next place. Leftists and progressives and socialists cannot see that everywhere they go, they destroy, and then they hate it, and they run to the next place that they love, only to destroy that one too. And every time they do it, they are the only ones who are always there. That's what they do. And that's why there's such a strong argument made on behalf of the folks who fight this battle every day that we have to stay and fight the battle where it is so that it doesn't spread elsewhere. Now, we'll talk about the other side of the argument in just a minute. Along with our website at GunGuyTV, we have a store, the GunGuyTV store. In fact, if you go to GunGuy.tv and click on Shop, it'll take you to the GunGuyTV store. You'll find all kinds of things there. You'll find reloading equipment and reloading supplies. You'll find firearms, accessories, targets, holsters, gun belts, slings, optics of all sizes and shapes, whether you're looking at something that's a telescope or some sort of magnified optic for your hunting rifle, or you're looking for a 1X optic like the Nikon P-Tactical stuff or whatever the case might be that you want for maybe your defensive rifle or for your shotgun for turkey hunting or whatever the case might be, or maybe for your handgun. You'll find those things there. You'll also find knives, and because we train security officers throughout the state of California, you'll also find some duty gear there, gun belts and duty belts, duty holsters, and that kind of stuff. I urge you to check it out. It's the GunGuyTV store. You'll find it if you just go to GunGuy.tv and click on Shop.
Shooting straight and always right on target. This is the GunGuy TV podcast.
Now, the other side of the argument is, I'm an American citizen. Why should I have to suffer under the kind of oppression, and let's just call it that, that's what it is, under the kind of oppression that robs me of my God-given and constitutionally protected rights, or if you want to, you could say my natural and constitutionally protected rights. Now, I believe these things were given to us by God, but you may not believe that. So we'll say natural rights, and we'll leave it at that. How about that? And so you say, well, I don't have to put up with this. Why should I have to put up with this? I'm going to move to a free state. And the argument is also, if I stay then all I'm doing is I'm helping out that oppressive government by paying my taxes and buying things in that state and fueling its economy. I'd rather take my money and my wallet and vote with my wallet and leave and hope that the economy in that state struggles and eventually collapses. And maybe at that point, those folks will wake up to the fact that they've made horrible decisions and that state will change. Or maybe that state will become in such bad shape that those people will learn if they move someplace else not to screw it up too. Well, I have to admit, I think there's some validity in that argument as well, because states like California do struggle financially because folks with money leave, and that's what's happening right now. The cost of living in California is so high. The cost of property, if you want to buy a home here, is so ridiculously, astronomically high that most folks can't do it. Likewise, if they are wealthy, if people are very successful and they're in this state, they've built a business or whatever, and they want to get out of here, well, if they keep their business here, they pay an awful lot of taxes, but if they move, they don't. Or let's look at it a different way. If you are at my age, I'm in my 60s, and you want to retire, California will tax your retirement benefits, but other states don't. So you may want to sell your house or whatever the case might be, gather up your stuff, and move to a state where when you're drawing your retirement, you don't pay state income tax on it. There are a whole lot of reasons to leave an overregulated, tax-burdened, right-killing state. And so a lot of folks will go for that reason. And when they do, one of those reasons, one of them is, I don't like the fact that this state tries to take away my free speech rights, tries to take away my Second Amendment rights, works very hard to make it difficult for me to enjoy the things I wish to enjoy, that I have constitutionally protected rights to be able to enjoy, like hunting or whatever. And then I pack up and I leave. And that's one of the many reasons why I do. Well, does it hurt that state to take all that money out of the state? I think the answer is arguably yes. And so there is a great deal of validity to the idea of packing up and leaving. In fact, a lot of folks do it. And they take a lot of money with them when they go. Some of them are multimillionaires and they go. Some of them, they're selling properties and bagging it and bailing, and somebody else is now stuck with the property and can't make as much money on that property because, if you think about it, my wife and I have rental properties, okay? We bought them 20 years ago, and so as a result, the income that we generate on properties we've had for 20 years is quite significantly more than the income that someone who bought them from us today would generate from it, because the cost of the properties is many, many, many times higher. And the cost of maintaining them is the same, but the cost of buying them is higher. So if they buy them with any kind of a loan, they're going to have much higher payment. And so when you try to pencil it and make money on it, chances are they're going to be upside down. So then what happens is, instead of making money, they're losing money, which gives them a tax deduction. They end up paying less taxes to the state than we would, because we actually have, those properties are cash flow positive for us. They actually help us pay our bills. And that's income that we have to pay income tax on. So in a lot of ways, packing up and taking your money and leaving does make a difference. Now, if they're buying a home, yeah, okay, and they're buying a home, they're going to live in it? Yeah, there's property taxes that are going to go to the state, and the state's going to get more money out of the property taxes, because we have something called Prop 13 here, which limits how much they can increase your taxes every year, and they're trying to get rid of that so they can raise property taxes a lot. So if they're just buying a home, sure, maybe the state gets a little bit more tax money out of it, but I think, honestly, in the long run, the state is hurt more by large groups of people, particularly people with money, leaving the state than they are helped by it. So in a lot of ways, I can see the argument. It does make sense that you pack up and bail and take your money with you. I guess at this point, at some point or other, you kind of have to look at the yin and the yang of it. You got to go, well, which is better? Do I leave and hurt the state that way, or do I stay and fight? And part of it comes down to time, money, roots, if you've got them. I'll give you an example. We stay in California not just to fight the battle. We're here anyway, and probably wouldn't move anyway. And a lot of that is because our kids are here, first of all, in San Diego County. And secondly, our church is here. We've been members of the same church forever. And when you have a belonging to a community like that, and that's where your friends are and your relationships are, you have deep roots in a place. we don't necessarily want to leave our friends. And you get to a certain age where you don't want to have to leave your friends and start all over again trying to make new ones. You don't want to leave and have to go to another church and start all over again. You just don't want to do it. And to some degree, you get to a certain age, you just don't want to move. You're in your house, you've been there a long time, and you think the whole prospect of packing up and moving seems so absolutely daunting and foreboding that you just don't want to do it. And so at some point you say, well, no, I'm not going to move. I don't wish to move. And by virtue of that, if I'm not going to move anyway, well, I'm going to stay here and fight. See what I mean? So a lot of times the decision is not necessarily as easy as we want to make it out to be. Well, people will say to me all the time, why don't you get out of there? Why don't you just pack up? If I was there, I'd pack up and leave. I said, well, yeah, but you're not here, and you don't have to make that decision. I am here, and I do. So think about it. We have a business here. We have our rental properties here. Our friends are here. Our relationships in church are here. Our kids are here. Our life is here. And if we move just ourselves, our life still stays here, and it takes a long time to move it over there. Well, I probably would be dead of old age before we manage to do it. Now, let's switch that around a little bit. My wife and I, if we find ourselves retired at some point or other, we're sitting here retired, and our kids are elsewhere, grandkids are elsewhere, or whatever, and maybe they move to another state, and we think to ourselves, gee, we'd like to see the grandkids once in a while. We could sell our properties. We could move to another state. We could cash out, buy a small place, maybe a condo or something in a town that we like, in a rural area, semi-rural area, a little town like Flagstaff or something like that over in Arizona, or Proctor, what do they call it? It's not, I started to say Proctor Valley, and that's here. But anyway, Paradise, whatever it is, over in that area, we find a place and buy a property and cash it out. And buy a big motorhome, and we can go visit the kids, and we can travel, and we can do that kind of stuff, and then we don't have to pay income tax on our retirement. Well, there's a reason to move. And then when we move, by the way, the bonus there is we move to a state where we actually get to exercise our Second Amendment rights. So my point behind the whole thing is that we should not, must not, and really we got to stop picking on each other because we make the choice to stay or go. It's a bigger choice than we want to make it out to be. It's not a simple choice one way or the other. Many, many folks pack up and go, and they fight the battle wherever they are. And many, many folks stay and fight the battle right where it is, in the heart of the most restrictive places. I've learned in my age, I guess, to respect both decisions and not to criticize either. Because there's a lot of life involved in those decisions, and it's not necessarily a one-issue choice. There's a lot of life in there, and there's a lot of life in there that people don't tell us about when they tell us what they decided. So let me just put it this way. If you are in California and you decide to stay and fight, then I want you to know I'm right here with you, and we'll fight it together. On the other hand, if you're in California and you decide to leave, I would encourage you, don't forget us over here. Help us fight anyway. Even while you're gone, you can help us fight from a distance. And wherever you are, whatever state you go to, fight like mad to keep it free. Don't let what happened to California and Oregon and Washington happen to you. Keep it free. And that's going to take your involvement and exercising your right to vote and getting involved in local politics and the things that you're going to need to do. Don't get lazy just because you move to a free state. That's how they become restricted. That's what happened to California. We were lazy out here. We were enjoying the sunshine and the beach. And the next thing you know, our rights were taken from us. So wherever you are, whatever you do, make sure that you're fighting like mad, either to keep your place free, or if you're in California like I am, or New York or New Jersey or some restrictive place, to make it free again. Well, thank you very much for listening. I probably ought to wrap up this part of the podcast here. And if you're on Patreon, stick with me. We'll be talking about growing up shooting and what kind of shooting did you do and what kind of shooting did I do and how does that shape who we are when we get a little bit older like me and we're raising our own kids or we're teaching our grandkids and we're helping them enjoy shooting as part of the American culture. We'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes on Patreon. So again, if you're on Patreon, stick with me. If you're listening to the syndicated podcast, you can always hear the rest on Patreon, or we'll just wrap it up here. Have a wonderful week. Thank you very much for listening and for all of your support. Whatever you do and wherever you go, please be safe.
You've been listening to the GunGuy TV podcast.